My name is Steve Ramirez. I'm a new science fiction writer. I have a book called The Great Migration right here. It is epic science fiction, but reads a lot like fantasy.
Your book, The Great Migration, can you describe your purpose in writing it? And what are you hoping that readers will take away from reading your work? And why should they read it?
Well, it's funny. I had never in my life thought about writing a book, and I was a big fan of Game of Thrones. And after season 8 ended, after all the hype and anticipation, I was really, my wife and I were both very disappointed. We had been kind of disappointed with a few shows we'd been watching and how they had ended. And I couldn't let it go. Like for like a week or two, I kept muttering and bringing up, like, I can't believe they just left all those cards on the table, and it seemed very rushed, very abbreviated. Um, you know, and she just looked at me. She said, "Well, why is it such a big deal to you?" And I said, I don't know. Like, is it really so hard to end these stories? Like, is it so hard? Is that the issue? And is that why we're always so disappointed with endings? And she had just had it with me at that point. She said, "Steve, I don't know. Why don't you go over there and write your own story and find out?" And I was like, "Hey, yeah, okay, I'm going to do that." And so I had a prologue kind of bouncing around in my head, the way I think a lot of people do. Um, and I sat down and just started to kind of put my thoughts into words. And um, I think because Game of Thrones inspired that action, I was doing it in like a fantasy genre. And after about a month, I thought, you know what, I love fantasy genre material, shows, books, whatever. But I'm more scientific oriented in my life. So I thought, I bet you I could take the broad strokes of what I'm trying to do here in science fiction. So I had to take some time off because I had to learn. I spent the summer studying like general relativity, some of the broad tenets of quantum mechanics, really kind of dove into it. And after, I started Game of Thrones, I believe, ended in May, about the first day of summer. I started that. And by the end of summer, I looked at my wife, I said, I think I've got something here. Like, I'm going to keep at this and see what happens. And like 18 months later, I had the book in my hand. It was really awesome. And then that started it all. Now I can't, it was an intended trilogy and it's going to finish as a trilogy. But because the impetus was I was disappointed in an ending with a show I loved, um, I started writing this with the ending in mind. So my intention, and it remains to be seen if I'm successful in this or not, is for somebody to be able to read the trilogy where the last line of the third book is the first line of the first book, and be able to go back and read it all over again with a completely different perspective on what they're experiencing.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting to get in that like Game of Thrones inspiration. Towards like the Great Migration itself, what is your favorite story or aspect of your novel?
There's a 4 chapter interlude right before the climax starts to peak, where I did some character and world building in the first 6 chapters. And then there's this departure from that. And I had 15 beta, like casual beta readers giving me feedback. And then after I had incorporated all their feedback into the manuscript, I contracted 3 professional readers to give me like this feedback and everything. And to a person, when those 4 chapters pop up in the book, they all said their initial reaction was more characters, like another city, like, because it's epic scope. But when you're only holding the first book, it's hard to keep that in mind. But all of them also said, by the time when they transitioned from the last page of that 4th chapter of that interlude to the first page of the next chapter, then they were like, okay, I see what's coming. Like, and then that helped the anticipation of the climax, because really the climax of the first book was the one thing I had in my mind the entire time I was writing it. And, it was always the kind of, I drive a lot for work because my territory is gigantic. So I have a lot of windshield time, and I would just put on, some orchestral music and think about these scenes and work them through. And it got to the point where when I finally got to that part of the book, like writing it, I was like, I can't believe I'm finally here. Like, this is the part of the book that I have been, thinking about for a year. And it was exciting to write. And most of the people, I mean, you're never going to please everybody. But I really try to find my readers, try to find similar stories. It's more and more difficult, I think, as time goes on to write something original because so many stories have already been written. So I kind of had to mash up some genres to get myself there. And that's why I said initially it is science fiction, but it does read like fantasy because the setting isn't, generally a lot of, I'm a big science fiction fan, obviously. But, a lot of science fiction is, having to do with extraterrestrial, like something in space, or perhaps something medically related or technologically related. Those are the general tropes. Oftentimes. So when I tell people, no, this is science fiction, they're reading, this alternate reality where there is no, modern technology, and I think they're kind of like, is this really science fiction? Like, in fact, I had several editorial reviews completed, and in a couple of the, catalogs of the reviews, it's still in the fantasy genre, like entry, and that's fine with me, because like I said, I'm a huge fan of fantasy, but really there are no fantastical elements. It is all science-based.
Yeah, that world building can be pesky because you need to find like that sweet spot and then you get into the real story. That's always the best part of those books. So what inspired you to pursue writing after a successful career in scientific research?
Like I said, that impetus was my displeasure with Game of Thrones, which it was obviously everybody that watches TV or movies is going to be inevitably disappointed in an ending, but that was the one I couldn't believe because it was such a good show. And this is all my opinion. I'm not, and I'm just talking about the 8th season. But once this story got in my head, like I couldn't turn it off. And I ended up telling my wife, I said, look, I'm going to do this. And I don't know how available I'm going to be. So just please be patient over the next couple of years until I can get this completed. And I started to educate myself on the process of writing. I didn't know anything about genre word count. The last 6, I read a lot of nonfiction, but the last 6 fictional works I had read were all 900 pages or more. But they were the Game of Thrones, the existing books, the 5 of that series, and a book called Shantaram, which was written in the 80s. So those were, it was different times in publishing. And I had this epic, I was intended to do this all as one book, just this gigantic book. And when I started to get educated on the industry, I realized that this is not an option. I'm going to have to break this up. And, and it's still, you get some leeway in fantasy and science fiction with page count and, word count. But it's still the upper end. It's the first book's 400 pages. The second book's it's coming in at just under 440. I'm trying to keep the third book at least at that or less. But I'm gonna finish the story, however the story needs to be finished. But I think I can do it. I become a little more economical in my chapter page counts, so I can gauge the overall length of the book. And I think I'm on schedule. Like the whole thing's outlined, half of it's written. Just got to keep at it.
So, how has your formal education and familial background translated to your work? Because it sounds like you're in research, right, as a career?
Well, actually, medical sales. Now, I'm a plasma specialist for genetic disease, but it really still is, I'm a field representative calling on doctors specifically. Sometimes doctors will bring me in to talk to patients because the therapy I represent is so specialized that if the patient provides their consent and we meet in the doctor's office at the doctor's request, then I can talk directly to them about their disease and about what their treatment options are, within the plasma therapy realm. But my undergrad degree is in criminology, and I spent almost 5 years in correctional rehabilitation, working with drug addicts and people with dependency issues. And it was challenging work, to say the least. It's very rare to get any kind of good news in that environment. And after, I think it was 4.5 years, I was like, I gotta get out of this. Like, I was about to take a job as a parole officer, and I remember distinctly thinking to myself, and I had no money at the time, if I take this job, and the job was going to triple my income, that was a good state job and something that when you're going through school, because my focus was corrections, not law enforcement, in the criminology field, I remember just going, this is going to be your whole life. It's just going to be, dealing with ex-cons, people. I'm like, I just got to do anything else, just anything but this. So I just took a leap of faith, took a sales job, and within a 2 years, I'd gotten an outside sales job, just getting my feet wet. And then I took a pharmaceutical job, did that for about 9 years. We got, the division got dissolved, but then I went into specialty respiratory, and then I found my way into genetic disease, and I really do like it. It's great. The downside is the territory is huge. There's a lot of driving and all that, but that's why I really got into writing, because all of that dead time, all of a sudden was time for me to be productive. And I had sticky notes, and I would take notes all day, or I would listen to audiobooks. Like there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond that was completely instrumental in the way I built this world. Because I wanted, earlier you asked me, what do you want readers to take away from this? Who should read your book? And it was so critically important for me to make the world building legitimate. Like, I didn't want to have any element where I just glanced over something critically important, like the economic structure or the government structure or the history of how that government came into being. And Guns, Germs, and Steel, just, I remember in the mid 2010s, I had this question, like, how did we get here? Like, how did modern society get here? How was colonialism even, how did that happen? Like, allow it to happen? And that's how I found my way to that book. And then everything made sense. And you started to see the critical importance of things like agriculture. And I don't just mean, just farming. I mean, who had the opportunity to start farming? Like, there wasn't, you had to be in the right latitude. You had to be in proximity to the right wild species, and that's plants and animals. And, even to this day, we've domesticated pretty much every animal we think we can domesticate. And it breaks it down like, these are the animals that can be domesticated, and this is why. And those were the little things that I took away. Those were a lot of my notes. Like, don't do this, consider this. And so I, because of the page count limitation, ultimately I made it a very isolated continent country, because I just didn't have the room to get into border politics. That if I wanted it to be realistic, I had to, I said, okay, I'm just going to isolate this community, create that as part of the story, and we'll go from there. But if I had to, on top of all of that, really get into border politics, fighting over rivers and arable land, this kind of thing. I mean, that could be a book in and of itself. And ultimately, I had to get to the plot line.
Yeah, world building is so pesky with these type of novels. You mentioned that The Great Migration is part of a trilogy. Can you describe a few of your other publications for fans of Great Migration, and maybe tell us when the next installments will be coming out?
Well, so The Great Migration is my first book. I'm sending the final corrections off to my formatter. Actually, last night I did it. So book 2 is complete. My plan is to release books 2 and 3 within 2 weeks of each other in September of this year, 2023. And so because of that, book 2 has not come out yet. I just thought, well, I'll extend, the release date 9 months. And then people that are into the story can get both books without having to wait, because book 2 does have, I don't want to say it's a cliffhanger ending, but something happens in the last page that will tell the reader exactly what's coming. And it's heightened, like where the story winds down, there's this element, this loose end that just pops up in probably the last page and a half. And I didn't, just because I'm a consumer for the most part, I'm a reader, I watch these things, and it's excruciating to wait for, the next installment come out. And I thought, well, I think for me, if it were me, as the prospective reader, I would rather just have access to the final, 800 whatever pages, as opposed to waiting another year for the final 400. And so that's the plan. And I'm very, very pleased with the way the second book came out. The readers seem to really like it. It took, the story's consistent, but there was so much going on in the first book. So, like you said, so much world building. The plot is not simple. There was just a lot to push into that 400 pages. That in the second book, I had a very clear idea of the first book, and I had a very clear idea of what the third book was going to be, because like I said, I began this process with the ending in mind, but I didn't have a good idea of what I was going to do for the second book, and it made me really nervous. And when it was done, it was just a deep dive into the primary characters, developing them so the third book makes sense. I found that everybody was just, to a person, like, that was great. There were some new characters, but they complemented the existing characters. And there's only going to be one new character in the third book, and he's been mentioned throughout the telling of the first and second. So the reader will finally get to see him in action. And I'm excited. The pressure's on. I'm so happy with the second book that now I'm like, okay, you cannot drop the ball in the third book. So it's been, work all day at my job and then work all night on this, just because there's only going to be one shot at it, and I gotta do it right.
Yeah. So, why do you think readers should check out your work?
Well, it's, being science fiction, it's not required reading for anybody. I would say that there is, I believe, because of the feedback I've gotten from readers, just unsolicited, people who read the book, it would appeal to people that have the epic scale science fiction and fantasy as a core kind of love, like those are the books they gravitate to. Those are the people I think will enjoy this. There is an epidemic in this book, and it's so contagion is a theme. The tropes of the contagion are very similar to something that I'm almost hesitant to say, because these, obviously they're not zombies, but that kind of frantic, kinetic, oh my God, it's happening and we got to get out of here. It's almost like a zombie apocalypse at one point. Now, that's not the nature of the book, but the disease is, it's it's living in the legend of the society right now. It hasn't been around for a century. And all of a sudden, the start of the book is like, wait, we think this might be happening. And the ending of the book is, oh my God, it's happening. So who's going to survive? And that was something I wanted to come through loud and clear in the first book. The question is, okay, well, who survives? Is it the strong or is it the lucky? And you realize that, and so everybody's resume is in the book. There's nobody that just shows up and says, okay, follow me. And all of a sudden they've got all these skill sets that you were unaware of. Everybody that gets to that climax and is involved in the climax, their resume is in the book. And it was important to me so that the reader could see it in action. All those implied skills that they had, they're in action. And you would, I do a lot of hiking in my free time, and I got really into it, and I would go out and be very remote for extended periods of time. So I had to read a lot of survival books, and there was a great one. There's a lot of great books on the subject, but Lawrence Gonzalez wrote one called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. And I took a lot from that book, to where, it's decision making in the moment, and then you have to hope you're thinking enough moves ahead that you're not going to get waylaid by some surprise element, and that's what you see in that climax. It moves very quickly. There's a lot of people going a lot of different directions, and some people go left when they should have gone left, and some people go right when they should have gone left, and you see it dwindle down for some, and for others there's just that hope of an escape always lingering in the distance that they're trying to get to. But books like, Deep Survival, The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley, that had a lot of impact. There's Disaster Diaries was another book I leaned into. There's a point in the book, in that 4-chapter interlude that I mentioned, where there's a character that has no survival skills, that is forced to find his way out of a tight situation. And it was one of the biggest challenges I had in writing that book, was that initial chapter where he is hiding and he's mentally collapsing. He's an academic, he's older, and he can't move, like he's frozen in fear. And so getting him up and getting him moving was a tremendous challenge. And there's a in those chapters, there's a statement that says survival, he's reflecting on what he knew on survival. And he said, so-and-so who trains, that there's a character who trains the military, trains the royal family in martial arts. He recalls that he's always approached survival as a mindset rather than a skill set. And that was the impetus for that character to get up and start to generate a plan as to how he was going to get to safety. And I found that to be a consistent theme in those books I mentioned, where, yeah, it's good to be in shape, and it's good to be young and strong. All these things are good, but if you don't have the mindset to survive, you're not going to. Given enough challenges that hit you, you really just, you can. And then in the second book, there's another character that brings in the mantra: you can never give up. If you want to live, you just can't give up. You got to keep pushing, and just that has to be your mindset until you get out. Because if it isn't, you'll break eventually.
Yeah, it sounds like your book is very well researched. That can get lost sometimes. So moving away from the book and more into you as a writer, what is your advice for aspiring writers hoping to write their own book?
Yeah, I'm very hesitant to give advice because I've written one book, and but what I have learned, and I think we've been talking about this up to this point, is to your point that you just made, I did do a lot of research, not on just survival and world building, but also, and The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley touched on this. I read a lot of Malcolm Gladwell books because he goes to this, but like, how does a human being's mind tend to react under high stress situations that are unexpected? Like what do we go through? The reason I bring that up is I wanted every element of the book to be realistic. Yes, it's science fiction. Yes, fantasy. The fantasy genre had a tremendous influence over the general storylines. But regardless of the broad strokes, I wanted the individuals, I wanted them to ring true. And not just for the common reader, but like I had a friend of mine is a psychologist, and I brought him in on my second book. I said, look, this is what I'm creating in these characters. What I need to know is, how is this going to manifest in real life? I don't need it to be a case study, but I want somebody with knowledge, a knowledge base in this field, to be able to read this and say, yeah, that could potentially happen. I don't want it to be ridiculous. So, and so what I learned was researching every aspect of your characters in your world, I think, is important if you want it to ring true. I, as I said earlier, had no knowledge of genre word counts. So what I would, if this is something you're going to do, and I think it's something anybody could do, I have only been encouraging people to follow that impulse. Like if they say, "Oh my gosh, I have an idea for a book," I'm like, "Do it, and learn along the way." You might have to rewrite that thing, 20 times, but just do it, because once you start, you're not going to want to stop. I mean, that first page of The Great Migration, I think I wrote it 35 times, because I would write it and then I would learn something new. And I'm like, that doesn't work. And I'd go back and change it. And then, but that was part of the process. And once you get that final chapter, the final book in your hand, you're like, okay, I'll stand by this, and so regardless, I know horror can get away from that, and some fantasy can get away from that, because there's fantastical elements to those. And I think all science fiction has to, get your knowledge base down, then do what you want with it. Like, we want to create something interesting for the reader, but I really, really wanted there to be heavy elements of realism in this incredibly unrealistic story, where I'm taking concepts like a multiverse and then generating a backstory as to how that's going to manifest, in a collision of dimensional realities. It just, I think anything, whether it's writing a book, approaching your finances, your personal health, your social circles, I think anything that's taken seriously, well researched, you think about it critically, derive some objective truths, for yourself, what you're looking at. I don't think there's a downside to that. Besides, it's generally harder than taking the easy way out. But that, if I was going to give advice, it would be advice I give on anything. It's like, if it's important to you, do it right. Stay true to your own vision. Don't be afraid to be original. And find, as far as it goes for books, find your reader. I mean, my book's on Amazon. Amazon touches 1 billion people in a day. I'm not trying to get 1 billion readers. I want to find the people that are going to enjoy the story more than anything. And it's given me fits in the marketing, because, on Amazon, you find other books and you try to advertise on those books. Well, mashing up genres is great if you're trying to write an original story, but then trying to find other books that are similar to it I have found that to be very challenging. So I'll take strong elements that I know, in other books, like metaphysics, thankfully, is a category, on Amazon in science fiction. And I'll go all in on that, because I'm like, okay, if somebody is open to this type of a concept, then hopefully they'll appreciate my story,
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. Research can be so important. Um, so those are all the questions that I had for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close?
No, I really appreciate being here. And it's wonderful. And as I said earlier, anybody who's watching because they've thought, hey, that would be kind of neat, or I have an idea, do it. I mean, everybody who's ever written anything has been you at one point. That's how they got to be a writer. Just go for it. Life is short, and I mean, I believe writing, or art in general, anything where you create, can be incredibly fulfilling, no matter where, most of us are always working toward a greater goal. It's very rare to find people like, no, I did everything, I'm done, but something like this to have in your back pocket, to give your day meaning, to give your thoughts meaning, I think it's important. And I found it to be a very, very healthy addition to my already, busy life, and a much needed reprieve from the demands of day to day, your work. And, I'm in my mid 50s now, and there's a lot of people in my life, in my peer group, where we're getting bad health information. Like meaning, oh man, so and so has cancer. Oh man, we're at that age where nothing's guaranteed, and it just lends more meaning to this. Because every time I write a word, or every time I complete a paragraph, that anxiety that I, was prone to feeling when I was younger about what am I doing with my life, it's diminished. And you realize you don't have to change the world. Just be in yourself and do what's important to you. And I mean, there it is. There's nothing wrong with it. You're not hurting anybody. Just be yourself and go for it.
Yeah, that's really important advice. Thanks. Well, that's all for today. So thank you, Steve, for taking the time to talk with me. And for those of you watching the video, if you haven't already, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Zara.